We're going to be having a great discussion, and we're talking about, of course, climate action and Canadian competitiveness today. So I really want to thank you for your showing up, because it is an important issue, and we'll get into that in a little bit first. Because I need to talk to you a little bit about how we interact. You are one half of the audience that is actually watching us today. The other half is watching us as we're streaming this live on the iPolitics Facebook page with the support of the Facebook Journalism Project. So to our viewing audience as well, this is like I said, a collective participation and be able to actually enjoy today's show. The way we do this, though, is a little different. For those who have never attended an iPoliticsLIVE event, we use a mechanism called Slido. So I'm going to invite you, this is where you're allowed to pull out your phones, tablets, computers, turn off the ringers, but log on to www.slido.com. You can see the name, the website beside me on the screens. It's slido.com. I'm going to invite you to enter the hashtag iPolEnergy. iPol as in iPolitics, energy. So that's what we're going to start off with. While you're doing this and getting familiar with it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Slido does. Slido is going to allow you to interact and ask questions directly of our panelists this morning, so you too can engage in the story. That is a key differentiator of what makes this a real and true live journalism event. You are going to be able to shape the direction of those questions by posting them, and audience members will be able to see what those questions are. You're going to vote them. You're going to give them a thumbs up, like a Facebook-like thumbs up, and those will get elevated to the top of the queue. And when we get time to the Q&A portion, those with the top of the queue are the ones Susan's going to be directing towards the panelists. So let's just see if everybody's got this right now. Okay, I've started it off with a little poll. By 2030, what percentage has Canada committed to reducing its GHG emissions against 2005 levels? Is it 30%, 25%, or 20%? Well, at least I can see that a lot of you are able to actually actively participate. Great numbers. The answer is, in fact, 30%, ladies and gentlemen. So we've committed to 30% to reduce our GHG emissions against 2005 levels by 2030. So without further ado, let me introduce to you the Honourable Sergio Marchi, President and CEO of the Canadian Electricity Association. The Canadian Electricity Association has graciously supported allowing us to bring forward this important topic today, and I've invited Sergio to come up and say a few words to frame the conversation for us all. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honourable Sergio Marchi.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure for CA to partner with iPolitics this morning. And good morning to everyone, and thanks for coming out so early, those in the room and those through Facebook. I also wish to particularly thank our moderator and our three panelists for their participation. And I'm also pleased to see a number of our CA members with us in attendance. To frame the theme for this morning, taking action on climate change is a critical challenge for our industry, our country, and our global community. Because we know that tomorrow's economy will be built on a solid foundation of clean, sustainable growth. And in that regard, we have a significant advantage here in Canada, namely access to abundant, clean, and reliable power. As you know, Canadian electricity is among the cleanest in the world. More than 80% of our power is GHG-free. Talking about numbers, as Andrew has, our industry has reduced emissions by nearly 30% since 2005 already, which is more than any other industrial sector across our country. And we're on track to deliver an additional 30% by 2030, all the while providing Canadians with reliable and cost-effective power. Canada's electricity sector operates at the nexus of economic growth and environmental protection. And this is a crucial factor to note because meeting our climate aspirations is as much an economic challenge as it is an environmental one. Our industry is uniquely positioned to further deepen reductions through the electrification of higher emitting sectors like transportation, space heating, and industrial processes. However, we must also recognize that the volume and the speed of the proposed regulations could pose important challenges in different regions of our country. While the obligation of governments is to provide a long-term, stable, and predictable policy framework, they also need to build in flexibility so as to accommodate regional economic and market differences. We must also have a clear-eyed national conversation about the costs of our climate actions, including the cost of inaction, and to do so at the front end of the journey. The goal is to strike the right balance and understanding between benefits and costs, which will enable us to forge a long-term national consensus based on an informed public. Today, with the release of our discussion paper and this expert panel before us, CA is hoping to make a helpful contribution to that conversation. Our climate strategy is a public-private partnership, and we each have obligations to uphold. In this regard, and as our industry continues to shrink its carbon footprint, I would propose that governments focus on 5 critical areas. First, Canadian governments must help mitigate competitiveness impacts by considering and ultimately using its fiscal and regulatory tools. For example, our largest trading partner, as it withdraws from climate efforts, lower tax rates, streamlines regulatory regimes, initiates retaliatory trade actions, renegotiates NAFTA, and potentially introduces a border adjustment tax, collectively, these actions pose a risk to Canadian businesses and their competitiveness. This matter, therefore, requires serious attention and a stiff backbone. Second, governments must reduce regulatory barriers to clean energy projects by facilitating infrastructure renewal and modernization. All too often, our members face conflicting and lengthy approval processes which just elevate costs and uncertainty. Third, governments must bridge the innovation gap that confronts our industry. There is a current disconnect between federal government policies that prioritize innovation and then provincial and territorial regulatory decisions which routinely reject our innovative pilots aimed at deploying new technologies. Fourth, governments must support and sustain a clean energy transition in northern and remote communities. Over 70% of remote and off-grid communities in Canada today rely on diesel for their electricity needs. Moreover, their residents face energy costs 10 times the national average, which in turn stifles economic growth. Finally, governments must build and sustain a national climate and clean growth consensus founded on an ongoing public education campaign. Public confidence is indispensable if we are to win this battle. In closing, fighting climate change will not be a sprint, nor will it be easy. And to find success, we will need to firmly establish where we are going, how we're going to get there, what the journey will cost, and then stay the course. But we have undertaken nation-building projects throughout our history. Think of the great railroads of the 19th century, the highways, seaways, and national broadcast systems of the 20th, or the Canadian-made arm that extended mankind's reach into outer space. All these transformative accomplishments were made possible because Canadians knew the importance of thinking ahead, of preparing the ground for future economic prosperity. I would suggest that we are again at one of those transformative moments, a time to build something important and something enduring, and to leverage one of our strategic assets, clean electrical power, to build that brighter, cleaner, and better tomorrow for all Canadians. Thank you for your attention, and I am now happy to pass the floor over to our moderator, Susan Delacourt.
Thanks, Sergio. Right. My work is now done. Sergio has set up the conversation, I think, very well. We're going to be hearing about 5 minutes from each of our panelists. I encourage you again, keep your devices out, ask questions, and if you've never experienced this this way of asking questions before, it is really an interesting and fun way of talking back and forth. So I'm going to introduce our panel, and John Kousinioris, Chief Legal Compliance Officer with TransAlta. Dale Bugen, Executive Director of Ecofiscal Canada. And Ingrid Thompson, CEO of Pollution Probe. So we're going to start with you, John, I believe?
Great, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much to both iPolitics and to CA for inviting me today. I think it'll be an interesting discussion. From my perspective, I think it'd be good to actually just begin with a little bit of an overview of what TransAlta is and who we actually are as a company, to give you a bit of a sense on our interest in the debate that we're going to have today. We're a big power generator. We're based in Alberta. We actually generate about close to a third of the power that is consumed in the province of Alberta. We operate in the US, across Canada, and in Australia. And we're a bit of a split company. We're the largest wind power company in Canada. We're overwhelmingly the largest hydro generator in the province of Alberta, but we're also one of the largest, if not the largest, coal-fired generator in Canada. So we're really a split company. And we're on the path to converting the company entirely to being one of the country's leading clean power companies, but it's going to be a challenging journey over the course of the next 13, 14 years for us to reach that target. We're on record as being big supporters of the climate leadership plan that the province of Alberta has put into place, and also the national framework that's been developed. So we're doing our part, or doing the best that we can, to actually help the shift that Sergio talked about, that is going to be required for the company to meet its the country, not the company, to meet its international commitments. I think when we think about the competitiveness of Canada in the context of environmental policy, I actually spent some time just going through the literature, most of which was economists, and as a lawyer, I probably couldn't understand more than about 2 words out of every 100. But what struck me was just how much there was a lack of consensus, effectively, at least in the materials that I looked at, in terms of what the effect of green policies were and the implementation of green policies were on countries' competitiveness. I think the best that at least I could discern was, in the 70s and 80s, there was a bit of a sense that it created a real drag. I think more up-to-date work would show that that isn't necessarily the case, although particular industries might be impacted. The issue was where you were sort of on a comparative basis with your trading partners in terms of the impacts that you would have, and the importance of trying to strive for a level playing field among those that you do business with the most as a country, to make sure that you, as best as you possibly can, are lockstep with them, all the while trying to meet the obligations that you have as a country to move forward. And it's a challenge for us, as everybody knows, with the United States, our biggest trading partner, and even some of the Asian countries, because they aren't necessarily moving in the same direction as we are, for example, on carbon price. I was looking at a bunch of statistics recently that were talking about what the effective carbon price was in various countries, and I think the highest one was actually the Netherlands, which was about 56 euros per ton of CO2 was their effective carbon price, so a pretty significant price. And there were a number of other Scandinavian countries that were sort of in the 40s, and then you got to sort of Germany and some of the other larger European countries, which were in the 20s and the 10s, and Canada's moving in that particular space. But what struck me, and I think it'll be no surprise to everybody in this room, that the United States was sub $1, China wasn't much different, and those are the countries that we trade with. So we are concerned, not because we have any quarrel or opposition to where the country is going, but I think we need to truly understand kind of the challenge that it is for the country to actually get there. And we're concerned that people don't really have a true understanding or realization of what that actually means. People often talk about Europe as being leaders, but I mean, I've lived in Europe for a period of time and worked there. I can tell you that living in a small, high-density city with a small footprint that's hundreds of years old, in a part of the world, I often think of Belgium, for example, 10 million people, and you can put it into Alberta 8 times, 9 times. So building the infrastructure that you need in that country, like transmission lines, as opposed to across the prairies, is not the same thing. And the costs aren't going to be the same. So we need to be kind of clear-eyed about that, and we also need to understand about what the comparative or the competitive advantage we've had as a country, and the economic composition of our industries compared to some of those countries, and what impact it has. So this is not me saying we shouldn't move forward, but we should do it with our eyes wide open and understand what it means that we need to do. I'm mindful of time, and I just want to touch on 3 things. When we think of the kinds of things that concern us, the first one is, and Sergio talked about it earlier, the CA report, I don't think there's been an appropriate public dialogue yet about what's involved. And I think Canadians need to understand, and Canadian industry needs to understand, what it means for us to achieve the kind of targets that we have. We've done a bunch of work internally, and I can tell you that the costs, for example, for Alberta just to get to where it is ambitiously trying to go are significant. Some of the modeling work that we've done would show that a medium-sized commercial enterprise that would be paying maybe $250,000 a year in bills for electricity today, by 2030 would be paying about $750,000. So it's a significant increase. They're going to have to prepare themselves for that increase. For Alberta to decarbonize its generation, it will need to spend probably in the range of $25 billion from now until 2030. And that's in a province with 4 million people. Just a bit over 4 million people. It's a big number, right? It's $5,000 a person, give or take. And that assumes that the demand for power doesn't grow in that period and it stays flat. And that isn't what people are predicting. We are expecting growth. So we need to have an honest discussion about that, and so that people understand what it means to, the standard of living in the country, what it means, the kind of choices we need to make in order to make our commitments. 2 other things. I just got the red panel. Here. So 2, I think we need to be very, very aware of the dislocations that will occur as well. I can tell you that 2 things there. There will be a lot of stranded capital, we expect, so people need to be mindful of that. And if the capital is stranded from investments because of a societal direction, our view is that the cost of that should be spread societally, as opposed to having disproportionately having one group of people share it. We're also very concerned about employment. I can tell you that in our company, what we're looking at is having about 1,500 people lose their jobs, probably over the course of the next 5 years, as we transition out of coal to gas power generation. The final point that I would make is I think it's also important that we try to deal with what I call, or what we call, regulatory drag. And by that I mean, it's one thing to talk about policy, but actually landing the policy so we have certainty and predictability to make the kind of investments that we need is critical. And I'd suggest to you that we haven't implemented things as well as we could. It's one thing to kind of have a vision, but getting the actual nitty-gritty in place to make sure that it's done in an effective way using, best practices on a go-forward basis is very, very important. And I can give you just 2 very quick examples before I wrap it up. We've been trying for 2 years to get a battery project, a storage project in Alberta in place, tied to one of our wind farms. And we can't. We can't get it in place, even though the province is willing to help fund that project, because the regulatory scheme that is required to ensure that we can actually bid that power into the marketplace, actually dispatch it appropriately, isn't developed. So we're kind of frozen in terms of moving forward. Another example would be, in order to convert our coal plants to gas, we have to build about a 50-kilometer gas pipeline to actually do that. And if we do that, we reduce the emissions by about 40% from those units. So it's a significant reduction. To get that 50-kilometer pipeline in place is probably a 3+ year project, and most of which will be regulatory approvals and permitting. By contrast, we did 180 kilometers in Australia, in 18 months, and that's from permitting to actually completion of construction. So we just need to be mindful of the drag that sort of throws sand in the wheels of moving forward. And I think I'm over time, so with that, I'll stop my comments now. Thank you.
Dale.
Great, thank you. My pleasure to be here. So the Ecofiscal Commission is a panel of economists from across Canada looking at kind of environmentally and fiscally sensible policies. So I'm going to build on what a lot of John has had to say. I want to take a closer look at what we really mean by competitiveness in the context of environmental policy, and in particular in the context of carbon pricing. And my commission's done lots of work on this, so I want to kind of dig into some of that split, and in particular differentiate between what we mean by competitiveness and really what we just mean by costs in general. And they're not quite the same thing. So let's do competitiveness first. Really the story here is the implications of more aggressive environmental policy here in Canada than in our trading partners. And the outcome of that kind of non-level playing field is potentially a shift of investment, of production, and of emissions to those jurisdictions with weaker policy. So that's something we don't like from an environmental perspective or from an economic perspective. It doesn't help really anyone. It undermines policy's performance. So you want to take that issue really seriously. You want to manage that issue. Fortunately, there are ways to do that through smart policy design. So first, let's note that this competitiveness issue is a smaller, more narrow issue. It applies very specifically to a subset of the overall economy. Analysis from our shop says it's around 5% of Canadian GDP comes from sectors that are both emissions intensive, that means they produce lots of GHG emissions per unit of output, but also trade exposed, that means they trade international markets and so can't pass on their costs, and they end up having to bear those costs and either lose profits or lose market share. So that's again, an important issue, but it's a very small set of the national economy. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, maybe more like 18% of the economy, so different profiles across different provinces. But the bottom line is carbon is only one factor in a company's competitiveness. It's not the overall defining factor. You got to think about corporate tax rates. You got to think about labor markets and availability of good labor supply. There's lots of things that affect competitiveness, and carbon isn't the only story by any stretch. The last part of this competitiveness story that's worth getting into is the fact that good policy really can solve that problem. And Alberta and the new federal backstop have really blazed the trail here for smart policy. And what they're doing is they're giving out these things called output-based allocations. And the jargon doesn't really matter. What boils down is this is support for those specific sectors, giving them incentive to reduce emissions from the carbon price by improving their performance, reducing the number of emissions they produce per unit of output, but not reducing emissions by shutting their production down and moving production elsewhere. So you've got the good part of that signal, improving performance, without the bad part of shutting it down and moving somewhere else like the United States. So smart carbon pricing can kind of do both. It can give you this incentive to reduce emissions, but not drive massive competitiveness implications. So the other part of the story matters too here, this bigger cost story. And you hear a lot that, yes, it's cost, it's one more thing for industry. It's going to break the camel's back. It's one extra piece to the puzzle. And fair enough, the idea here is that we can minimize the costs of reducing our emissions as well. Now, these costs would still exist even if there was uniform policy across the entire world. If the US, Canada, Europe, Asia all had the same carbon policy, there was this perfect level playing field in a perfect world, there'd still be costs. There's still costs to this transition. And those costs aren't competitive per se. They're not about the imbalance in that non-level playing field. They're just about the costs of making this significant transition. As other panelists and John and Sergio have noted, this isn't free. It isn't free to make this transition. That doesn't mean we don't want to make the transition. It's worth making this transition because the costs of not doing it are greater, but there are costs. Again, there are ways to minimize these overall costs too through smart policy. Number one, you want to rely on low-cost policy, which really is carbon pricing policy. Carbon pricing gives markets incentive to find their own smart way to reduce GHG emissions without imposing specific solutions from government top down. That means you can minimize your costs. You minimize the cost of achieving those emissions reductions. Number two, you want to maybe in very specific places rely on complementary policies to do what the carbon pricing can't. That's not an open invitation to throw more and more policies at the wall to see what sticks, because bad policies are unnecessarily costly. The more you do carbon pricing, the more you can get away with getting rid of some of these policies that just cost too much. Better to rely on the cheaper policies to drive your deep reductions rather than the high-cost ones. We've got some recent work from my commission on that issue as well. Number two is smart use of revenues. So carbon pricing generates revenues. That's an opportunity for provinces to use that revenue to do other things that drive benefits, whether that is cutting taxes, whether that's investing in technology or infrastructure. There's different ways to do it with different pros and cons, but that money shouldn't be wasted. Number three, get going now rather than later. This is a really important piece. It ties back to this idea that these costs are unavoidable. Yes, the transition costs money, but the longer you wait, the more money that transition costs, the more it costs to go. Better to go gradually, slowly, predictably, as John has noted, by getting these policies in place and signaling where they're going now than waiting and then having to shock the economy with really aggressive policy late in the game. That's cost that we can avoid by being proactive. So bottom line, we've got kind of two problems, the cost of policy, but also this competitiveness issue. We've also got solutions, and that solution looks roughly like carbon pricing, smart, well-designed, broad carbon pricing, smart complementary policies, getting rid of the costly policies, using revenue widely, and providing this transitional temporary support to emissions-intensive sectors to address this competitiveness issue while it's there, while the rest of the world catches up, while we start to move toward this global system. It's going to be a little bit slow. That patchwork will take some time to level out. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Ingrid.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. You know, thank you very much for inviting me to be here with the CEA and iPolitics. It's a great event. And I'm sort of mindful that I'm here in sort of anchor position behind some very excellent points that have been made. What I'll start with is just to introduce myself and Pollution Probe for those who don't know us. Pollution Probe is the granddaddy of the environmental sector in Canada. We actually started back in 1969 before there was such a thing as a Ministry of the Environment in Canada. And we partially, I guess, pushed values along to the point where that started to happen. And since that time, we've sort of reinvented ourselves many times, and we've focused on many issues, including things like, the first ever a blue box pilot that happened in Leaside. I was just learning about that because it's well before my time, or getting phosphates out of detergents and a bunch of other sort of things along our journey as a nation towards today, where we have a fairly well-embedded set of environmental values coast to coast. And working with that, I actually want to point out, because I think it's important to remember there's good news in all of this, is whatever happens next as we go on our journey of transformation towards meeting our Paris goals, is we do have a solid foundation of environmental values. People, while we talk about costs, and generally if you ask people, do you like paying more costs? The answer is going to be no. But if you sort of measure that against what are your values, what are you willing to pay for as Canadians, that's sort of a better way of asking the same question. So I'm very mindful that Ecofiscal and others are doing excellent work to sort of try to quantify and dig down and understand the specifics. I come from a background in my career before I got to Probe of working through communications, and I just did a bunch of years in Europe working in change and transformation, communications, and strategic planning. So I'll declare a bias, which is that when you have a hammer, every problem does tend to look like a nail. But I do think there's some things we can address, and I'm starting to see that happen. And I think the discussion paper that the CEA is releasing today has some very excellent points about, we do have to start to have, as John said, honest discussion about what is involved to achieve our Paris goals. I personally come from sort of the tradition or was part of the storyline in Ontario where we didn't actually do that. We pretended this was going to be easier than it was. And after many, many years of constricting, investment, we had, and I won't blame, this is not a blame situation, but we had a minister of energy who started to say, no, it's going to be fine. We can, get all this investment done, and it's only going to cost 1% to 2% per year, which, everyone who's watching the story in Ontario will know that that's not exactly what happened. So I think we have to first off, as a sort of basic behavior as an industry, start getting behind this idea of honest discussion. What is really involved for all of us to achieve these goals? And I think we might be surprised if we frame this well and honestly. And there's another piece I'll get to in a minute. I do believe that there's a way to thread this needle that will, without avoiding costs, at least get a reasonable degree of support. I think consensus is a word I'm nervous about. We use that a lot in Canada. Again, I've just spent a lot of time in Europe, and consensus is rarely the goal there. We talk about, getting majority support or 2/3 support rather than consensus around things, especially things that are difficult. What I do think I'm seeing, and again, I'm coming back after quite a lot of years out of Canada, so that's an interesting sort of fresh eyes point of view that I bring. We're sort of emerging from the discussion about the what we're going to do. We have our what sort of laid out. It's the how discussion that we're sort of entering now. And that is, a difficult discussion to some degree. But again, with the work that's being done with organizations like EcoFiscal, like the CEA, that we're starting to narrow down our options. We're starting to get a greater degree of wisdom about what it is that we need to choose, or at least what the options are we need to lay out to get to, the goals that we're trying to get to. The CEA's paper had a line which I thought was quite, important. It does take a village. It takes a village to get, a nation, a whole lay population to understand what, the energy experts who, use terms like base load and so forth, reliably, this is a conversation that is actually very difficult to break through, but it's not important. And I think to get there, we all have to become village people, to use the line a little bit cheesily. When I started back 20 years ago, and I was starting to learn about the energy sector from zero, that was a time when in Ontario we didn't have all the different, we call them the alphabet soup agencies. We had Ontario Hydro. And I had a funny thing happen where I was really struggling because I can't remember what the complicated issue was that I was trying to make simple enough to be conveyed to sort of the voter nose level. And one of the smartest strategists I knew in the then Premier's office said, Ingrid, don't worry. There's only 4 or 5 journalists who write about Ontario Hydro issues, and nobody understands their stories, right? So that was sort of the then, and I think we've made quite a lot of progress. There is quite a lot of attempt, at least, to break down the barriers of understanding. But we haven't necessarily gotten to making it simple for people to take action. And I just want to underscore how important that is. Load shifting is an example of something that we tried in Ontario. We brought in smart meters, and we pretended that just technology plus regulation would equal behavior change. And guess what? That didn't work, right? And when you dig down into why it didn't work, people went, well, what can I actually shift? I don't have the thing on my dishwasher that says it can delay 6 hours. I don't have, the actual methods, the action routes. So let's remember that identifying the ways that the tools that people have to get to the behaviors that we want them to do at street level has to be a big part of the mission as we continue to have this discussion. And I'll end by saying a couple things. One is I just spent, 5-8 years living in the Netherlands, and you talked about what the carbon price is like there. There's a few other things that they have to teach us. And one of the most interesting ones, it relates to approval of energy projects at community level. Because I still don't understand how a country with such a high degree of environmental values, and it's really, embedded in not just their culture, but their behaviors and their mindset, they can still develop infrastructure like you've never seen. How did they get to do that? How did they succeed and we don't? I want to understand that. I think that's an interesting area for us to dig into as an international best practice. And I guess the final thing I'll end with, because I think I'm running out of time as well, is as someone who spent a lot of my career as a consultant, we used to have a saying, and it's funny because it's true. We used to say, when a client wanted something, we'd say, good, quick, or cheap, pick 2 out of 3, right? Well, I think we need to think about in the energy sector, as part of our honest discussion, let's remember the energy version of that is, clean, cheap, or reliable, right? So we do have to sort of think about this as a situation where, people can understand that when you put it in a formula that way. What are you willing to give to get your price to go down? The clean or the reliable? Or what are you willing to give up to get the reliable, the clean or the cheap? So, we can actually break this down to a degree where, the broader community can start to enter this debate. And I want to compliment, there's a great initiative going on at NRCan right now with Generation Energy that's trying to sort of do that coast to coast. We have to support it. We have to inform it. We have to be part of it. And I think events like today are a good part of at least taking some smart steps along the way. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. That was very interesting. And thank you to all of you, too, because I see that you have been actively asking and voting on questions. The number one question, I think, is something that you guys have all touched upon, which is how do you get the public on side with this? John, you talked about honesty. We talked about distinguishing between cost and competitiveness, and Ingrid, you talked a lot about this too. But I think the audience here would like to know. I think there must be a lot of communications people here. How do you get the public on the same page? And I like this idea that doesn't have to be consensus too, but how do you do it? John, do you want to start?
Sure. So it's an interesting question, and look, and I'm not a communications expert, but I'm mindful about what one of our directors has told me, and his name is Yakut Mansour, and he used to run the basically the organization that oversees electricity in the state of California. And he talked about, and when you think of the United States, I think of California as kind of being the leading jurisdiction from an environmental perspective in terms of setting the agenda and actually driving change in that country. And what he said is, and he was there at the time when Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor, and he recounts the kind of dialogues that they were having years before they were going to actually proceed to actually drive changes in environmental policy by, mandating renewables procurement and all the rest of it. Multiple years of trying to get the population to understand and accept a vision of the state being a leader in that country and Californians themselves being proud of and accepting, and again, not consensus, but the majority of people being on side. So they deliberately went over a period of many, 3-4 years before they actually began to kind of feather in the various environmental policies to make sure that people understood what they were trying to do, understood the vision, could actually articulate it in a reasonable way and get it to be accepted. I don't think we've done that in Canada. And I can tell you, we do a whole bunch of polling in Alberta, and what strikes us anyways when we do the polling is, people, it's easy for people to say, we're in favor of coal-fired generation shutting down. But when you ask them the next question of, well, how much would you be willing to pay to see that happen? The dollars are almost laughable, by comparison. So people are kind of environmentalists, but in a very, how can I put it? And that's probably not the right word, almost in a flippant sort of way. It's somebody else's problem, somebody else is going to fix it. Like, that's not right. Everybody's got to own it, and everybody has to do their part. There is no somebody else. Everybody's got to own it. And I think people need to understand directionally where it is that you're trying to go and why. The case has to be made. And I think it can be made before you proceed.
Dale, do you
Sure. So, I mean, as a bunch of economists at Ecofiscal, we are not always great at this question. But that being said, I think that there is a story about costs that matters to the public and to this kind of broad attitudes towards policies. And I think that we are slowly but surely emerging from this false idea that economy and environment are in conflict and that one comes at the cost of the other. And really, Ecofiscal is all about the idea that if you do policy really right, and if you design policy well and implement it well, you can have both, and that those aren't mutually exclusive ideas, and that they can back each other up, and in fact, they must back each other up. You don't really have a functional economy without an environment to backstop it, and vice versa as well. I think the Canadian context is interesting. I mean, our challenge on one hand is federalism and the fact that we have these different provinces doing different things. But in a funny way, it's also proving quite useful as we start to experiment with different policies across the country. And we're now starting to see what is working and what is not working. We're starting to have years of experience in, for example, British Columbia, and evidence that their emissions are lower than they would have been in the absence of that policy. Their economy is going stronger than anyone else's in Canada's. That real-world evidence and real-world experience of how these things play out and how these policies can work, I think is starting to matter as well and starting to bring new evidence to bear.
Ingrid,
So, I mean, this has been my wheelhouse historically, and I have to, again, be a little bit careful because I don't want to sort of stray out too far on this. But I do think, again, we have to stop being so focused on, when you say public acceptance, we can't define that as no one is going to be upset about this. That's not going to work. This is too hard. I mean, this is a challenge we got ahead of us, people. And so setting the bar at consensus is to me too high. But when we are, engaging with the broader public, I think we make the mistake of, we do two things wrong historically. One of them is we think it's about giving them information, and information is important. Let me be clear about that. But information doesn't get to, mindset and value shift. To get to that, any marketer that's grown up in any part of the world knows is you have to get to the feel. You have to get to people's emotional state. So, we went, okay, we can't just give people a list of statistics about, supply mixes and figure that's going to get them to get behind a clean energy transition. So now we have to show them sort of a beautiful story and pretty pictures, and that sort of happened. And then, you got people go, okay, I'm with you. I'm willing to buy into this value set and vision of clean energy, but what can I do about it? How do you want me to change my life when I've got 3 kids and soccer practices and whatever, and we didn't get it down to the sort of customer-centric, action-based, here's what you can do level soon enough. And so that, unfortunately, has the consequence of upsetting people a little bit, and then it's harder to get their attention next time. So it's harder to get awareness, and it's harder to get engagement at the value set level. But again, I do want to go back to what I said at the very beginning, is we do have a good values-based foundation for this transformation in Canada. Let's go back to that, and let's, as an industry, unfortunately, the energy industry has a very sort of engineering culture, and engineers are not much better than economists at doing broad public engagement. But when I've worked with them and I've explained, here's the best practice, and remember, you can't just tell people once. If you're not absolutely bloody bored with what the message you are delivering about how to do this, it's not getting through. You can't run a commercial just once or twice and expect it to have an impact, right? So I think these discussions are very important. I think it's critical that we don't just talk to rooms of ourselves, which is another thing the energy sector is really good at, is we go and sort of talk to a bunch of people that already agree with us a lot of the time. We have to break out of that and be willing to go into rooms where people will maybe disagree and have problems and raise issues. But as my Dutch friend said, one of the biggest solutions to solving infrastructure problems or transformation problems is learn how to have a fight, learn how to have a discussion, and don't expect that you're going to get 100% consensus. So I think that's a good place to stop.
I'm just going to add, take some moderator's liberty here and add another layer to this question, because I think an interesting thing that's been going on in politics in the world where I work is that a way to get people to vote, for example, or to participate has been to tell them about their neighbors. And I know the energy sector has been doing a bit of this too. It's behavioral economics, which is if you know your neighbors, if you're competing with your neighbors to keep, and I know Ontario has been experimenting with this, right? So is that a way of, and this will sort of segue to the next question too, but are behavioral economics or nudge theory a way of getting public acceptance or the public to sign on?
I love David Halpern's work. Sorry, I'm diving in. The sort of behavioral economics, which isn't just in Ontario, I think the federal government's there. They've got a special unit. I don't know if they've been charged with the decarbonization goal, and if they haven't, that's something that we can all get behind, writing that letter to get that started. I think behavioral economics. There's also the psychology of motivation, which gets down to at the individual level. And let's not forget, we actually have quite a lot of knowledge about this just from our marketers. And advertising isn't necessarily an industry that's keeping people occupied as much as they used to be. So maybe that's an opportunity. There's a lot of people who have knowledge about how to get people to change mindset and behaviors. I think getting all of that together in a room, including people who work in the media industry. There's also a few people who have a little free time from that sector that could be applied to this problem. And again, I'm pretty optimistic that could be a great place to start.
Taylor John, do you?
Yeah, let me chime in quickly on that one. I think, there's a role there.
Yeah.
But don't convince yourself that that's all you need. I think Canada has a long, sordid history of unsuccessful climate policies, and I think part of that failure has been trying to rely only on easy things like information or targeted subsidies. And I think that we can't forget that the real problem, the fundamental problem here, is the fact that when it's free to produce GHG emissions, then we do, and more than we can and should. So they can work together, I think, but not as substitutes for each other.
And John? Why don't we start with...
I'm a lawyer. What do I don't know.
Well, then I'll start with you with the next question too. With what initiatives can Canada work toward to keep us at the forefront of clean energy?
Yeah, it's funny because I've been looking at the question, and I have to actually confess that I don't really understand what it means, and let me explain what I mean by that. So, from my perspective, I talked about regulatory drag. I think, frankly, Canadian companies, whether they're crown corporations, whether they're the private sector, whether it's companies that aren't Canadian-based companies, companies from other parts of the world that are interested actually in investing in the company and moving clean energy generation forward, I think they would do it and are willing to do it as long as there is kind of stability, clarity of policy, predictability. Speaking for our company, we're continually worried about, things moving forward, but in a jerky kind of way. There's sort of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, half a step back, and making, those kinds of commitments. So imagine going to your board of directors and asking them to approve $1 billion to do something that's clean energy related, or 100. It's not cheap to do this stuff. And, going to them and saying, I don't have a contract. I don't know where the government regulation is going to be on this. It isn't clear what's going to happen if there's a change in government because the other party is talking about slowing things down. We're not quite sure where environmental policy is going. We think it's going to become more stringent. But should we make a bet on gas, which is more efficient, but that actually emits carbon too. So it's a difficult, when you're trying to allocate capital, it's a bewildering discussion to have because all you have is gray. It's just a tremendous state of flux. So I don't think we need perfection. I think that's what I've been hearing from my colleagues here. But we kind of need to land, the boat a bit. And if there's a policy vision that's been set, actually do the stuff that's implemented, not wait for multiple years before we actually have some visibility to what the actual detailed rules will be. But if there is policy certainty, and I mean not just domestically, but also internationally to the extent we can, that's helpful. I think that actually helps drive people forward because the biggest thing that I think businesses hate is risk. So if you can de-risk the decision-making that they do, I think they'll respond. But the one thing that I wanted to say that confused me is when we talk about being at the forefront of clean energy, a lot of people talk about, the country being kind of a place where there's a lot of technological innovation that takes place. So there's a lot of, manufacturing or development of these kinds of product that can move things forward. I have to say, and I hate to be the one that says it, I remain a bit skeptical on that. And I'm skeptical about that because I'm just mindful, we're a northern country with 35 million people with an R&D budget that's only so big. I can tell you right now, when we put up our wind turbines, the stuff doesn't come from Canada. Like it comes from Europe, it comes from Asia, it comes from the United States. The R&D is all done there. It's not done here. And it's not just our sector. It's been notoriously the case in Canada across the board that we've had these issues. Solar panels aren't made here. They're not going to be made here. They're made in China. We can't begin. So the issue with solar is how quickly can you assemble it in a cheap way? That's different than actually driving the technological innovation about the panel to put it in place. Even when it comes to efficiency, I think there's things that we can do, and I think the government's looking at doing things in terms of our building codes and stuff like that. I'm very mindful, though, that, we talk about appliances and the technology that goes to smart meter, all those kinds of things. That's storage, for example. The U.S. is spending billions a year on R&D to do storage. I'm not sure it's all that efficient for our country to be spending billions a year on storage because I think, I don't know, we're going to be the ones that actually, maybe we will. I'd like to think that we can. I'm just trying to be realistic about it. So that's kind of a weird answer, but that's sort of my view on the answer. I think we need to be honest with ourselves. I think we can green the grid for sure, but are we going to be the country that's going to drive the innovation to make that happen? I'm not so sure.
Some quick thoughts. We've only got about 7 more minutes, so I do want to get to at least 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah. Other thoughts, though, on...
To me, this question is about the innovation gap that Sergio talked about in his remarks. Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of LDC sector folks who are really getting squeezed when they're trying to bring in pilot projects and they can't figure out how to get them funded. The regulator's saying no. So, can we solve that? I'm not sure I agree with John that de-risking everything for business along this journey is the right way to go. Maybe we need to sort of consider how is it that other countries and sectors and well, not sectors, but I think the Canadian intolerance of risk in the innovation cycle is something that I don't know how to fix that, but I'd really like to see that change a little bit because maybe we need to figure out if there's a safety net that can be built that makes that less of a problem. But I think this is a big part of the solution. I also agree. But I don't think innovation is just about the technology. It's about the technology integration into systems. So maybe that's where we can still, get a little bit ahead of the parade if we focus a little bit more.
Can I just respond to the degree? I know we're short of time. My brother was recently, he works for a large pipeline company. He's one of the executives there. He's head of business development there. And they were recently, you talked about the Netherlands, they were in Amsterdam, right. Looking to actually do a project in their port area. And I can tell you their entire Canadian team was stunned at the ability of the Dutch authorities to actually tell them with detailed granularity what the timeframes would be for the approval. They had a can-do attitude about, you want to do this here, we'll get it through in 6 months. This is the environmental spin, that's the word they used, not the word our guys used, that you need to do to get this thing, because they're talking about storing petrochemicals effectively. You need to do A, B, C, D to get it through. They came through and they said, it's difficult to even begin those discussions in Canada, let alone to have a small team. And we see the same thing in our business in Australia, where they actually have like SWAT teams in government that actually help drive through projects with certainty. That's what I mean by, I don't mean, taking a risk of capital to move forward, because frankly, I don't think that we're much different than other companies are that we deal with around the world. It's more the certainty to make a call and kind of have a sense of predictability of, I need to do these 6 things to actually make the bet that I need to make. The difference was, they actually were ashamed when they came back.
All right.
And to your point about getting stuff done.
So I think people would really like to hear from all of you, even if they're just quick thoughts, on where you think nuclear power generation fits into the future.
I'll start with the easy one. So the joy of carbon pricing is that you don't have to choose. You don't have favorite technologies. You don't have to say, I like electricity from wind here and solar there and nuclear there. The idea is not to put those choices in the hands of governments, but to let the market figure out what costs less, what makes sense for business to put in place, and let markets do their work. So there's more nuance to that answer that these guys might have to say, but that's the big picture story from my side.
You get bonus marks for going to the next question, too, on that one. John?
Coming from Alberta, we don't have nuclear generation. I know Ontario, it's a critical part of the mix here, and it looks like it's going to continue to be a critical part. All I can say is, when I look to France, which is 95, 96% nuclear, they've used it as a competitive advantage, for sure. It's how their industries kind of competed against Germany by having low power prices, through the nuclear that they've done. So I expect nuclear will continue to have a role to play here. I was with my son on spring break in this a few years ago in San Francisco, was pointing out all these things that were great about, how they were ahead of us in Calgary on various environmental things. And I finally got mad at him when he talked about bike lanes, because I said, we actually have more than they do here, damn it, in Calgary, where the weather isn't as good as it is here. But it was interesting. He kind of said, well, we had this debate in school, Dad, and you work for a power company. I go, yeah. He goes, how come we're not all nuclear? So this is my 15-year-old at the time, just kind of saying, like, it doesn't emit. Like, I don't know, what is it with you guys? You're doing all this stuff. So I don't know. I think there'll be a role. It's hard to permit it and get it done, though. It's just it takes so long. So I think we're kind of, we've built a lot of what we've built.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, I'm going to get beaten up. Norm Rubin is going to find me on Facebook for saying this. But, I think if you look at what does it take to achieve Paris, it's an if-then problem. I don't think how do you do it without nuclear? It's some amazing, innovation will have to drop out of the sky for us not to accept and support nuclear as part of the supply mix if we are determined we're going to meet our Paris goals. I should say this is a little bit more of a personal opinion than related to work that Pollution Probe has done on this. And I accept, my point earlier about not getting consensus. There isn't consensus in the environmental community about this, but I think there's starting to be more pragmaticism about this. And, Pollution Probe, we are a fairly pragmatic organization, so, we aren't going to take a position that says, you have to do it without, especially in Ontario. That wouldn't make any sense.
In the spirit of democracy and time, I'm going to ask you all just for some really quick 30-second thoughts on carbon pricing. So give us your best 30 seconds on it. John.
Look, I think it's probably the best tool that we have. I think, at least speaking from a TransAlta perspective, it is by far the most effective way to go. We'd rather have pricing, as you were alluding to, rather than having a command structure where the government is intervening and picking winners and losers and actually dictating how things were going to take place. I think by having a carbon price that that is clear and applies as broadly and as consistently as possible, not just domestically, but internationally. That's the best way for ways to go, I think, and will result in good decision-making long-term.
Yeah.
Yeah, lowest cost option to reduce GHG emissions, so it just makes sense. You got to make sure you handle things like the competitiveness problem or the fairness problem, and making sure that the distributional impacts of those kind of policies are managed. But they can be. Good design means good carbon pricing, means kind of smart policy overall.
Ingrid.
Yeah. I mean, again, carbon pricing, I agree with the statement from, the work done by the Eco-Fiscal Commission. It is the most cost-effective way to get the changes you want to happen. But, again, to this industry and to our governments, then we've got to stop sucking and blowing about price signals, right? If people, don't like price signals and, instead of adjusting behaviors, get their problems or their feelings solved by just being really unhappy at governments over and over, they're going to learn that that's how you fix the problem. So carbon pricing will only work if we are honest up front about, changes that are going to happen, and then stop sucking and blowing about letting the price signal do what it's supposed to do.
Well, I would like to thank all the panelists. I know it's Canada Day, but there seemed to be a sort of a Netherlands Day to a lot of the conversation too. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to the audience for all of your great questions, and good luck out there in the traffic as you leave here. Andrew.
I want to just iterate Susan's comments there. Thank you to the great panel for your discussion this morning. I know we could go on literally ad nauseum all day on this issue, and there's no shortage of questions that came through. I also want to thank Susan for your contribution this morning and helping facilitate this. So we sincerely appreciate it. We wouldn't have been able to make this possible at all without the gracious contribution of the Canadian Electricity Association, so the Honourable Sergio Markey and his team. So thank you for bringing forward this discussion today. You've heard reference numerous times through the morning about a report. If you go on to slido.com, you can download the report that is being referenced from the CEA that was published. We've uploaded it for you. You can download it from there. It's a PDF, feel free, as well as the program of today's information. We talked about the questions. There were a lot of questions, and what happens with those questions, I'm sorry we didn't have more time to get through them, but I'll tell you what happens with them next. I do bring them back to my newsroom. We do look at them. We examine them. We know that there is a good story couched in a good question. It's one of the things you learn in Journalism 101. So what we will do is we will examine those. We will pass them on to my reporters. I will also take a look at them and make sure that that our sponsor and our panelists also receive copies of those questions so they can know what issues are burning Canadians right across the country. And finally, of course, purely from a creature of self-interest that I am, I'm going to take a look at those questions and then see if I can find future events and discussions to be able to have on those. I want to thank you. This is, this concludes we started iPoliticsLIVE last September. We've concluded now today our 30th show of the season in our first season, and I want to thank you, our audience. Thank you for joining us and for becoming engaged and supporting us the way you have. Again, I said at the onset, your engagement and participation helps really shape the future of journalism, and this is the future of journalism where we can engage audiences directly in the story. So thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our numerous sponsors that have participated and supported us throughout the year as well. So with that, we're going to take a summer recess too. The Hill has taken a break, and now it's our turn. So we're going to take a couple of months off. We're going to regroup as we prepare for the fall, but I can guarantee you we're already busy working on our fall lineup. We're going to be talking about topics again, including we're going to be holding the government's feet to account on the defense review that was just released. We're going to be putting the pressure on for July 1, again, as July 1, 2018 approaches, to be known ever forward as Cannabis Day, I think we said, right, Susan? Cannabis Day next year. There's a lot to be done there. We're going to be looking at the health sector. We're going to be looking at trade again, as the trade file is going to become heating up once again in August. And then, of course, we are going to be looking at energy and the environment again later on in the fall. So I welcome ideas, stories, suggestions. Please come see me or any member of my team there afterwards. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation today. Have a safe and wonderful holiday, and we look forward to welcoming you back in September. Thank you.